The state of Maine, with its unique extensive coastline, independent spirit, and working waterfront, is leading the way in the development of sea vegetable aquaculture. The 2014-2015 growing season was the 5th year of seaweed cultivation in Maine, with new techniques, species, and farmers. Sugar kelp, or Saccharina latissima, was the first species to be cultivated in Maine and continues to be grown as an important new food crop. 3 sea farms along the coast partnered with researchers at the University of Maine's Center for Cooperative Aquaculture Research, or CCAR for short, and the University of Connecticut's Marine Biotechnology Lab to grow out new native crops. Industry partners included Maine Coast Sea Vegetables in Sorrento, Maine Fresh Sea Farms in Bristol, and Bangs Island Mussels in Casco Bay. A Maine Sea Grant-funded project led by UMaine researcher Dr. Susan Brawley and Sarah Redmond of Sea Grant is developing culture techniques for 3 new native sea vegetables: laver, or Porphyra umbilicalis, also known as nori; alaria, or Alaria esculenta, also known as wing kelp; and dulse, or Palmaria palmata; and skinny kelp, or Saccharina latissima forma angustissima.
Wave-exposed shores of Harpswell, Maine, we find a kelp that has adapted to a very turbulent environment. Because of its unusual strap-like shape, we have called this kelp the skinny kelp. Our team at UConn has partnered up with 2 farmers in Maine and have successfully cultivated this sea vegetable.
Cultured sea vegetables are a winter crop, having a growing season that extends from fall to spring. Sea farmers prepare for the season by clearing lines and setting and checking moorings to be ready to put out seeded lines and nets. September and October are the typical planting months for most sea vegetables. Spores from native Porphyra were seeded onto lines and nets using a custom-made seeding wheel at CCAR. The juvenile blades were cultivated to a length of several millimeters in the nursery and placed out on the sea farm on submerged horizontal longlines in September. By October, new growth was already visible. Spools of seeded alaria were produced in the nursery early fall by seeding the microscopic spores onto string and culturing the gametophyte through juvenile sporophyte stages. This string was then wound around submerged longlines out at sea. Planting of seeded lines of skinny kelp and dulse took place later in the fall. Seeded spools of skinny kelp were produced in the marine nursery at UConn using native parent plants from Maine. Seeded line was unspooled around long lines and placed at depths of 4 and 6 feet. Seeded dulse spools and nets were produced in the nursery by releasing spores from local reproductive dulse and growing up the juveniles to several millimeters before placing out on the farm. By late fall, early winter, the Porphyra line was showing impressive growth with good dark color. And the alaria was already visible on the lines. By January and February, the Porphyra line was ready to harvest, with large dark blades with good flavors.
Yep.
Ludicrous. So we got it.
Plants were dried in whole and sheet form for sampling. By January and February, many of the skinny kelp lines showed sparse growth, with plants beginning to be visible along the line. Some of the deeper lines were beset with fouling, while the shallower lines had better success, with plants that were up to 40 centimeters in length. Plants were exhibiting the long and skinny morphology of the parent plants. The Alaria lines, too, were growing rapidly, reaching lengths of 100 centimeters and more. The seeded dulse was also becoming visible on the line, up to only a centimeter or more, with some problems with fouling. However, the dulse plants that had been gathered from the wild and attached to lines earlier in the year in Bristol were deep red, clean, and large enough to begin harvesting. The winter of early 2015 was a cold one, and farmers struggled with problems of ice over in some areas. Floating icebergs moved moorings and lines and caused unforeseen problems on farms. In early season kelp, Alaria was ready to harvest by March and April. Plants were clean and healthy, with lengths up to 10 feet. The skinny kelp was growing rapidly in early spring with long, skinny, and sometimes spiraled blades. The seeded dulse was also increasing in length, with bushy, deep red plants developing on the lines. May and June are typically harvest months for sea vegetables. Crops are vibrant, actively growing, clean, and healthy. The skinny kelp crop was ready to harvest in May and June, with some fouling starting to appear later in the season, and some differences between the farms. The skinny kelp was ready to harvest earlier on in the southernmost farm in Casco Bay, with blades up to 8 to 10 feet and narrow widths of only a few centimeters. Blades were strap-like with some slight ruffling at the edges and thicker than the typical farm sugar kelp blade. The taste was fresh and mild with a good consistency, especially for salads, making it a promising new kelp crop for Maine. The Alaria was at the end of its season in May, with fouling starting to appear at the ends of the blades. Some of the Alaria grew unusually wide on the farm, with very large sporophylls, which are also edible and delicious fresh. The seeded dulse lines were showing active growth in the spring, but much of the seeded dulse on the horizontal long lines had begun to bleach and foul by May and June. Two exceptions to this, however, were the plants on the seeded net and the plants that were shaded by a neighboring sugar kelp line after the lines had tangled. These plants were remarkably cleaner, with better coloring than nearby plants on the same line that had not been shaded. In Bristol, the wild collected dulse had developed large bushy plants and continued to be harvested. By early summer, the skinny kelp plants were still growing on the lines, but were fouled on the distal ends with hydrozoans and required significant trimming. Some of the dulse lines were hung vertically in the water column over the summer to look at the effects of depth on growth through the summer months. It is important to determine the unique seasons for each of the new sea vegetables, and this year gave us a better sense of when to plant and harvest each crop for the best quality and yield.